Good afternoon, everyone. We're glad you're here, and we're working through everyone's nightmare of Zoom not behaving well. So while we work through that, we've invited people to use the chat function, and be sure to click on all panelists and attendees. And as you join, let us know what you love about the place where you live. It's hard to do icebreakers and networking on a webinar, but we'll do the best that we can. I'll also invite you to change your name change your Zoom name, upper right hand of your Hollywood square. If you click on the three dots at the bottom is rename. So I'm going to rename myself Nancy Smith, GrowSmart Maine, and then feel free to put in your preferred pronouns as well. That way, because we don't have a chance to do introductions all around, it'll be easier when we have conversations coming. And I believe all of my volunteer facilitators are here. So we're working on the issue of Zoom not offering up breakout sessions that'll come at 5 o'clock. But in the meantime, we have a lot for Jeff to present as well. And it's 4:07. Jeff, how do you feel about us starting while Emily is working through the details on the breakout room?
It's really up to you. I can do that.
Yeah. Oops, sorry, this is Emily speaking. I also wanted to let you know I'll be putting all of the data that people will be looking at. The attachments will be available via links on our website, and I just put that information in the chat box for everyone to see.
All right, well, we have 23 folks joining us, so I think that we'll get started and hope that the Zoom magic returns rather than the Zoom gremlins that we're dealing with right now when we need them. But again, as you're settling in, drop into the chat just something to all panelists and all attendees about what you love about where you live. And rename your Zoom self with your name, your organization, and your preferred pronouns so that we have a sense of who we're working with at this point. So with that, I'm going to dive in and welcome you all. This has been a couple of months in the works. I'm very excited to have Jeff Levine presenting for us today, and I'll offer just a little bit of an overview. First off, reminding you that this webinar is being recorded, and by the end of the week, if not by tomorrow, we will have it up on our website to share with you all. A little bit of context and then why it matters as to how we got here. GrowSmart Maine, if you're not familiar with us, is a statewide nonprofit organization helping communities manage change. We do our work through advocacy, community engagement, and events. Securing housing choices for a well-rounded community began as a breakout session at our 2019 summit, and it was incredibly popular. And the response at that time showed to us that there is potential to do this more broadly. And so we've been looking for ways that we can engage with audiences about securing housing choices for a well-rounded community. The other side of this is the Southern Kennebec Working Communities Challenge. GrowSmart Maine is part of this effort. We're in the middle of a 6-month pilot, along with 7 other pilot projects across Maine. The Working Communities Challenge is hosted by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, with many Maine collaborators as well. The goal is to advance regional collaboration to build strong and healthy communities. In the midst of this 6-month process, this pilot project where we get to try things out, there's also an application process for funding for a 3-year program, taking the learnings that come with the pilot project. The Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, if you've been a supporter of GrowSmart over time, you may recognize this as they were a keynote speaker at our 2012 summit, where they spoke about what was then the Working Cities Challenge in Southern New England. It's now being adopted as the Working Communities Challenge for those of us in Northern New England. I want to recognize the other steering committee members of the Working Community Challenge for Southern Kennebec County. It's Kennebec Valley Council of Governments. Will Harper curated the data that Jeff is using today. The Augusta Housing Authority, United Way of Kennebec County, Maine Housing, the cities of Gardner and Augusta, and Kennebec Valley CAP Agency. We opened this webinar up to a statewide audience beyond the Southern Kennebec County because we're seeing that communities across the state are grappling with this issue, whether it's too much growth or too little growth. And we know that these connections and conversations are incredibly valuable. So now a little bit, 3 quick points on why housing choices matter. You all received Jeff's PDF of his presentation, so you know that he starts looking at the Maslow's hierarchy of need. Housing is a solution to so much more than where you lay your head at night. That there are societal issues like substance abuse, poverty, crime, that are all entwined in a lack of safe, affordable housing. The second thing that I particularly piques my interest in this webinar today is the connection to housing from other smart growth areas, such as transportation, but also economic development, land conservation. The cost of living is so much more than just the cost of housing. And GrowSmart Maine is the one statewide convener that brings folks out of their silos, whether it's regional or by policy area, to talk about how all of these things tie together. Our goals for today, even with the target for the Southern Kennebec Working Communities Challenge, is to have an initial regional conversation about the current housing stock in the region. And we're using 14 towns from this region as an example for these conversations. And also to support the other working groups around the state. GrowSmart Maine is partnering with a Presque Isle Caribou group that's also working on the connection between workforce and housing and economic development. And finally, we want to give you all the tools to provide information and perspective, highlighting that housing choices add value rather than damaging a community culture and property values, and using this language and the information here to address what we're often seeing or sometimes seeing as opposition to affordable housing. So that's who we are, how we got here. And early on in his presentation, Jeff will outline the agenda for the day. Hopefully by then we will have working breakout sessions. If not, we will improvise as we always do and find ways to keep the conversation going. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jeff and start the formal program.
Thanks, Nancy. Great introduction. You know, I'm lucky to be on the board of GrowSmart Maine, and Nancy's the one who keeps us all in line and gets stuff done. So it's been really fun to work with her on this and a lot of other projects that GrowSmart Maine's been doing. One just sort of logistical thing, Nancy, I think that they can't rename themselves unless you give them permission.
Okay, let's see if I can do that.
Yeah, so try again in a little bit if you couldn't rename yourself earlier, or don't worry about it. It's not that big a deal. So thanks for having me. I just a little bit of an overview today. You know, Nancy gave a good introduction, and we're right on schedule. We're actually a minute ahead of schedule. I'm going to talk a little bit about some housing tools and data. I think for people who registered, at least by yesterday, you got an email with sort of 2 packages in it. One had just a huge data dump that can be really intimidating when you first open it. And the second is some slides about a couple of housing tools. There's a lot of different housing tools available to try to sort of address housing issues. And this isn't an attempt to be comprehensive or to be an expert in any one of them, but to give you a sense of what the universe is. And, you know, at the end, you sort of put the peanut butter and the jelly together, and the jelly being the data and the peanut butter being the tools, and you figure out what really makes sense for your community or the types of communities you're interested in looking at. Nancy's also going to give us a little bit of a legislative update because there's been a lot going on at the state level on housing policy. Housing's really having a bit of a moment in Maine, and I think nationally. And you know, I think it relates back to some of what Nancy talked about, the realization that if you don't have a safe, comfortable, convenient place to live, it's really hard to do all the other things that society expects of you as a citizen. And the idea that this is really a basic thing, it's not something you earn, it's something you need to start with. we're going to go through this presentation for about half an hour, then we'll leave a little bit of time for question and answer. And then the plan is to go into breakout rooms about 5 o'clock. There'll be 3 different sort of types of breakout rooms. And since there's a fair number of attendees, if we need to, we'll have 2 of each of them. And then we'll reconvene towards the end, and we'll have facilitated debriefs from the breakout rooms and wrap up a little before 6 o'clock, because I know everybody's got lots to going on this time of year. So I think Nancy sort of stole my favorite line. You know, I like to look at the hierarchy of needs from Maslow. There's a lot about this online if you want to read about it. There's a lot of different ways to look at it. The basic idea being that there's these different layers of what, you know, a human being wants and needs in life. Starts with very basic things. And the red at the bottom here works its way up to, you know, nirvana, to the self-actualization that everybody hopes to get to. But there's several different pieces along the way. And before you even get to some fairly, what I consider some fairly basic things like personal safety or a feeling of belonging or even a feeling of self-esteem, there's some really basic physiological needs that people have. You need food, you need water, you need to be able to sleep. You know, in today's society, you need clothes. Hopefully you have at least decent health, if not great health. And then shelter is really an important part of that. And again, this is not something that people earn as they get higher up the hierarchy of needs. It's really a very basic human need. And that's something we keep coming back to in terms of the idea of thinking about trade-offs, you know, for housing, is to realize that although it may be something you're willing to trade off as one person, to another person, it's really the very bottom of their pyramid of needs. So I always try to think about it that way, and it helps me realize how important it is to work on housing issues. One thing I want to talk about, the term affordable housing gets thrown around a lot, and it's a kind of a convenient shorthand, but I think it's important to unpack it a little bit, because at its root, really, when people say affordable housing, they mean generally housing that's affordable to people who maybe aren't making a ton of money. And that's actually a little more complicated than that. Affordable housing at its root is really just housing that requires no more than about 30% of a household's income. So you can be higher income and be quote unquote housing burdened if you're paying more than 30% of your income on housing. Now, in that case, it maybe doesn't matter as much because your income is that much higher. But sometimes I think there's some confusion about affordable housing versus housing that's affordable to people below a certain income level. So I often use the slightly unwieldy term below market affordable housing. It takes a couple extra syllables, but I think it's more self-evident what it means. And oftentimes when you look at what is below market, what income levels are you looking at producing housing for, it tends to go back to what's called area median income. And this is a calculation that's done by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and it's generally done by housing markets. So there's several different housing markets that they outline in Maine. And that's because housing isn't something that's in one town and not in another. It crosses municipal lines. So it's important to think through, if you decide to move to an area, you might look at more than one community in that area. So how can you sort of lump them together and get a sense of that overall housing market? Kennebec County is super convenient in that respect because it's a county and it's an income limit area. So it's one of those cases where the lines actually match up, unlike in many places. So for Kennebec County, which is the area we're really focusing on today, the median family income is $68,700 as of the latest calculation. That doesn't mean that everybody's making that, or that if you make less than that, you immediately have a housing challenge. That's the median family income. What this calculation does, it's also a confusing piece of it, is that it also tends to vary by the number of people in your household or your family. This chart uses family, but it's somewhat interchangeable in many circumstances. So often as shorthand, we refer to a household of 4 people, and that's the bold numbers here. That's because it's really hard to refer to 10 or 12 different numbers to try to, so if you look at the column with the 4 on it, you'll see 3 different numbers. The one at the top is what's considered very low income at 50% of area median income. And that's about $35,000 a year. The extremely low income is is another calculation that's often used for federal programs. And then 80% of median income is also used. Now, you might say 50% of this isn't 50% of this number, and that's because, again, this is for all households or families, and the ones on the right are really broken out by size of household. So you'll see, for example, if you look at what can someone afford for a studio apartment, you'll often use the one person income limits. If it's a one bedroom apartment, you might look at the 2-person limits and so forth. But sometimes as just a backhand, you'll use the 4-person family and you'll use some basic numbers. You'll often see 80% of median income as a baseline. So in Kennebec County, you know, the number 57,350 may be a number you see a lot when people talk about below market affordable housing. This is mostly put this in your packet so that you can refer to it later. This is takes those numbers and also breaks out what would be considered an affordable rent at those various incomes based on number of bedrooms. So let's look at the 2-bedroom column quickly. And you'll see that for 80% of median income in Kennebec County, an affordable rent is considered to be $1,290. And one thing I'll say, I think people often find these numbers to be higher than they think they should be or they are. And that's been my reaction often as well. That's sort of the upper limit of what that household should be paying. It doesn't mean that everyone should be paying that amount. Unfortunately, in reality, many people are paying more than that. So looking at that idea of housing burden, this is just an example from Hollowell from 2018 numbers. This is the renting households in Hollowell, and it's broken out by what percentage of their income they're paying in rent. So at the top, you see, as you go clockwise around, 59 lucky households are paying less than 15% of their income on rent. As you work your way around the wheel, you'll see that there's 105 households that are still doing pretty well. They're paying 20% or less of their income on housing. And then as you go all the way around, you start to get to these areas that are in red. And those are households that are rent burdened. They're paying 30% or more of their income in rent. So these are households that are paying more than potentially they ideally should on housing. It doesn't mean they're not able to cut corners in other ways and make ends meet, that people are often very resourceful about something as basic as housing. But it means that in general, housing is going to challenge their ability to pay for other things in their lives. And you can do this analysis using census data for almost any community, for almost any year. I just happened to have Hollowell handy and thought it was a helpful example. So then the idea is, well, if we want to try to address housing shortages, not just for below market affordable housing, but housing in general, we feel we're looking to solve a problem. And as we go to the second side and look at the data, you'll get a sense of maybe what problems or challenges exist in various communities. And there really are different solutions for different situations. It's important to realize there's not a toolkit that you can be handed as a community and just plug and play and say, okay, now I'm going to do this tool. I have this set of 4 tools. I'll put them in place. I'll search and replace all of the generic names in these ordinances with the name of my community, and I'm all set. Unfortunately, or fortunately, it's really not that simple. There's a huge range of tools, and they tend to make sense in different situations. So in this diagram, you'll see, the traditional new urbanist transect going from very natural zones with no development through rural areas into slightly more developed areas that they're terming suburban. A lot of communities in Maine are not really suburban, but may have that type of build pattern. You get into urban areas and you start to see these denser built out areas. We really don't have a lot of these urban core zones in Maine. And then on the far right, you see these assigned districts, which is kind of a special term for new urbanism. But there's different tools in different areas. And one way of looking at it is some things make sense in rural and suburban areas and maybe don't in urban centers. Some tools make sense in urban centers where you're starting to look at a lot of density and others don't. So, this is by no means definitive, but I try to sort of match up what types of tools might make sense for different areas. Just kind of brainstorming once. That doesn't mean that there aren't other ways to slice this. This is kind of an attempt to potentially overwhelm the senses by showing one set of what the universe of all the types of tools you might be able to use for housing development are. And again, this is not just for funding below market affordable housing necessarily. This might be any sort of housing challenges. Some communities may not necessarily have an affordability challenge, but maybe the types of housing units they have are sort of big older houses, and really what they need are more housing units for, you know, 1 or 2 people, because those are the folks who really want to live in their community, or there's a shortage of housing in studio and 1-bedroom apartments. So it's not just a set of tools to deal with affordability, but also to deal with other housing challenges. And I've tried to cut them into sort of 5 different types. Again, this is not definitive. This is just sort of my brain's instinctive effort to try to organize this sort of big list of things. So on one end, you have these sort of funding for more housing tools, things like housing trusts, affordable housing tax increment finance districts, you know, getting land for free, or you know, selling some land to pay for housing projects on another part of land. Municipalities providing site preparations, so getting money to help clean up a site that maybe had an old gas station before you sell it to a housing developer. These are all ways of funding more housing pretty directly at a municipal level or from another nonprofit. Then you enter sort of the area of preserving existing housing. You know, there were a lot of below market affordable housing developments built in the 60s and 70s and even into the 80s that had what seemed at the time to be extremely long restrictions on their affordability. They were supposed to be affordable until 2015 or 2020. Wow, that's really far in the future. We're never going to have to worry about this. And I like to say I spent a lot of my city planning career cleaning up a lot of those expiring uses, because by the time I showed up, it was 2015. And suddenly we had 200 units of below market affordable housing that were about to not be affordable anymore. So thinking out ways to preserve existing housing sometimes is a challenge, depending on what your housing stock is like in your community. Thinking about preserving housing simply, just making sure that housing units aren't torn down by investing in them, and then addressing these so-called expiring uses that were created with programs that are sort of becoming ripe, and you know, you have to face the situation of how do I extend this affordability. Up on the far right, in sort of the hot pink, are more tenant side programs. This is more ways of helping individual households as opposed to addressing housing issues from the housing side. So these are things like trying to prevent evictions and trying to thread that needle between, you know, landlords needing to pay rent, needing to get rent in order to maintain their property, and tenants maybe having, you know, a few bad months and trying to avoid getting evicted. Things like home buyer assistance, where a household may be able to make the mortgage payments but struggles with down payments. Rental assistance is also sometimes used in this sort of pool. Looking at housing safety, which several communities in Maine have started adopting housing safety ordinances, where they actually might inspect rental property to make sure it's not dangerous. And then, you know, even more extreme things like rent stabilization, where a municipality may actually limit how much rent can go up from year to year. Again, not necessarily saying any of these are right or wrong tools, just sort of outlining the universe of what's out there. Going into the bottom here, you see land trusts. I put in kind of a slightly separate pot. And that's not necessarily because it couldn't be fit in with one of these other areas, but I think there's also a lot of interest in land trusts. So I wanted to kind of call out that as another potential tool. And I'll talk in a little bit more about land trusts, with the caveat that I'm not a land trust expert personally. I'm sure several of you are. And then on the right corner here, you see land use tools in the light green. And these are ways of actually adding the ability to develop housing through looking at your zoning and looking at other regulations you have through site plan or through subdivision laws. One of the ways that a municipality, for example, can most help housing production is to make sure that their zoning is not limiting the type of housing they want to produce. And sometimes there are little things in there that may not seem like a big deal, but they add up. And so you end up saying you allow multifamily housing in an area, for example, but developers not being interested because the parking requirements are too high and the setbacks are too high and the lot sizes are too high, and I have to go through a site plan review process, things that maybe add up over time. So let's just talk through a few of these. And like I said, it's important to realize that these are not all tools that should be used everywhere. This is really that sort of toolbox that you bring with you to the place where you've been called to fix something. And it turns out you only need a screwdriver and a hammer. But you bring all the tools because you just don't know. So looking at housing trusts, which is one of the funding sources. And this is a nice sort of simple tool that almost any community can do. The challenge is it's only useful if there's actually money other than in these tools. So this is a dedicated account that a municipality holds for housing production. It's like an enterprise account, and it's a place to put funding for housing production in your community. And it's something that can survive from fiscal year to fiscal year, so it doesn't get zeroed out at the end of the year. And it creates an ability to have some local funding and control for housing production. The funding comes from a bunch of different places. Sometimes communities will actually fund it through their budgeting process. I think that is a challenging thing to do because you tend to be competing with other things. Other ways are through sales of municipal property. If there's tax acquired property, for example, sometimes some communities, when they sell the property, once they've paid off with tax liens, they might put the balance into a housing trust. Sometimes there's development mitigation or inclusionary zoning requirements that can help fund a housing trust. I sort of tell communities they don't have to decide exactly how they're going to fund a trust when they create one, but they should be pretty committed to figuring out how to fund it because there is some administration needed. So don't create a housing trust if you're really not going to use it. On the other hand, there's often lots of creative ways to find funding for a trust. Accessory dwelling units, I just am flagging this as one of the land use tools because I could talk about all of them all day, but I wanted to jump on one of them. And Nancy's gonna be talking a little bit about some legislative updates at the state level related to accessory dwelling units later. Many of you know what these are, but for those who don't, they're sort of what traditionally might have been called in-law apartments or somewhat outdated, and I don't really like the term granny flats. Some people do know the term. Generally, they're relatively small second units on a property, and they tend to not be as visible as the primary house. So you may have a single family home, and around back, there's another door that goes into an in-law apartment or an accessory dwelling unit that provides a second housing unit on that site. And they often provide an option for people who maybe want to stay in their house or have kids they want to live with, but maybe not live too close to, things like that. Sometimes they provide supplemental income if they're rented out. In many communities, there's a requirement that one of the two units be owner occupied. So you can't just have them both be rented. That's nothing sort of magical about that. That just happens to be how many communities apply accessory dwelling units. Generally, they're less visible from the street. And then finally, like I said, there are some legislative updates in Maine about accessory dwelling units. New Hampshire allows them by right statewide with some local controls allowed. So every single family zone in New Hampshire has to allow accessory dwelling units of some form. And I believe Vermont has the same rule. Another land use tool, just looking at things like zoning for what you want to see. If you want to see below market affordable housing, maybe you sweeten the pot a little bit. You provide a density bonus, for example. So if you have a minimum lot size in your community of, let's say, 1/2 an acre, you might say if you provide, if 20% of the single family homes in your subdivision are affordable at a certain level, maybe the minimum lot size goes down. So the developer actually is able to make more homes in general, and you get a few permanently affordable homes in return. That can also be used in an urban area. Portland adopted an overlay for multifamily housing that provided a density bonus for projects that had a fair number of affordable units in them. And again, not comparing state to state, but there is a program in Massachusetts that actually provides financial incentives for communities to do this. So if you create some sort of smart growth zoning with density bonuses, you actually get funding from the state to help pay for additional services that you might be worried about funding. Some of the housing sort of preservation type tools, as I mentioned, there's a fair number of affordability restrictions in what have traditionally been considered affordable units in Maine expiring. I ran the numbers, and these are a couple of months old, but there are about 171 developments in Maine in general that may actually expire by 2030. And 2030 seems like a long time, but as you know, it's only 9 years away now. That's a lot of units that potentially could stop being affordable in the next 9 years statewide. So I always tell communities to at least make sure they don't have expiring uses that are coming due soon. If they do, it's really helpful to have a conversation with the property owner see what they're thinking about for their property, and maybe there's a way to have a win-win there, where potentially, you know, you could help them find funding to renovate the building in return for an extended affordability restriction. In some situations, you might be able to allow them to build additional market rate units on the site and you know, also keep the affordable units. It's just important to have that conversation and to have it early, because it can take several years to put a deal together that actually works for these expiring uses. Land trusts, like I said, I'm sure many of you are way from more expertise, have more expertise in this than I do. The basic concept is to separate the ownership of the land from the buildings, and the land would be owned by a land trust who can control things like making sure that the units are affordable over time. Generally, they'll provide a long-term lease to the residents to build buildings on it. Sometimes a 99-year lease, it can depend. And on the flip side, when the residents sell their home, they might live there at a rate that would be more affordable than somewhere else. When they sell, they're expected, they'll still get some profit, but they're expected to have it be proportional to some extent how much they've been paying over time. This helps prevent foreclosures because it reduces their financial exposure, and they tend to have a local basis, which is one of the things that's really nice about land trusts. You tend to have a local group that helps sort of monitor and manage this. It's not some company holding a deed restriction somewhere, you know, across the country. Moving into another area, home buyer assistance. This helps lower income households sort of buy or fix up their first home. Often it'll provide some portion of a down payment. It may provide money to do repairs if you need a new boiler, things like that. And these sorts of programs are often structured as a no interest loan that is forgiven over a certain amount of time. So you might structure it as a 10-year no interest loan. And after 10 years, you basically rip up the loan papers and you forgive the loan. If the household sells before then, they might have to help pay for part of to help pay off the boiler. Sometimes it's structured as a soft second mortgage on the property, and sometimes it can be funded in partnership with local lenders. Moving on to another sort of subject area, Maine has an affordable housing tax increment finance program, and this is actually very unusual among states. It allows you to create a tax increment finance district that is based on the idea that the housing in that district is affordable. And the basic rules are that at least 25% of the housing in that district has to be affordable at or below 120% of area median income. So those are actually fairly high numbers. Again, we went back, if you look at those area median incomes from the previous page, you'll see that those are actually fairly high numbers. It can help, one of the things that's most useful about TIF districts is that it allows for a cash flow over time for a developer or an owner or a set of owners. It's not just a one-time influx, but it allows you to help pay for ongoing maintenance or reduce your housing costs over time, because it's essentially a reduction in your property tax bill every year for the life of the TIF district. I mean, this is a tool that I think is generally pretty useful. The other advantage of the TIF district approach is that in some situations, it might be that the development wouldn't happen otherwise. So you're not actually necessarily giving away tax revenue ahead of time. You might be sharing additional tax revenue over time. So I'm going to hand it off to Nancy here a little bit to talk about some of the legislative actions going on. It's been a really busy year at the state legislature.
To say the least, it has. And Jeff, I put in the chat to you some options we have to consider as we look at what to do at 5 o'clock.
Great.
So so as I mentioned before, GrowSmart Maine does our work through advocacy, community engagement, and events. And I love when I can entwine them in each other so that they inform each other. And this is one of those opportunities while we have this event to talk with you about what's going on at the state level in the legislature. Here are a few bills of particular interest to housing choices. I encourage you to review this list. When we send out to you the summary we'll send you a copy of the recording and links again to Jeff's information on our website. I have about just a 3-page summary on these bills. So that you can follow up and look more in depth. The first section of tiny houses and accessory dwelling units is what I'm calling small steps advancing tangible options. Every municipality will be required to allow tiny houses and accessory dwelling units where they allow single family homes with some level of municipal oversight. GrowSmart Maine supported both of these bills while recommending changes, and we fully support the amended versions. Now, LD 1530, which is about tiny houses, did not receive unanimous support in the committee, but it passed in the House and the Senate and has been signed by the governor. LD 1312, which addresses accessory dwelling units, did receive unanimous support in the committee, though later it was amended in the House. It is now on the special appropriations table with a small fiscal note. Next up is extending Maine's historic rehabilitation tax credit, which Jeff had mentioned as a tool. GrowSmart Maine fully supports this bill through our leadership in the Maine Alliance of Smart Growth. LD 201 extends the sunset for Maine's historic rehab tax credit from December of 2025 to December of 2040. This bill received unanimous support in the committee. It's passed in the House and Senate, and it's sitting on the special appropriations table, even though the fiscal impact doesn't begin until the years 2026 and 2027. So we're a bit curious as to why that's happening, and we'll be following up. Addressing rental changes. These are two bills that GrowSmart Maine did not testify on, though as members of the Maine Affordable Housing Coalition, we support them and note their connections to the work of the Southern Kennebec Working Communities Challenge. You'll see LD 473 there with rental assistance and a voucher guarantee program. This again is a bill that came out of committee without unanimous support. It passed in the House and Senate, and it's now on the special appropriations table with a $9 million fiscal note. LD 1508, which is about preventing homelessness by establishing the eviction mediation program, again, came out of committee without unanimous support. It has been enacted in the House and Senate, and it is awaiting the governor's signature at this time. The next section is getting to the root of the problem. This is primarily studies and commissions. GrowSmart fully supported the first three listed here that are lined up for this year, and we plan to engage in those studies as they move forward. You may have heard of LD 609, which addresses zoning and land use regulation barriers to housing opportunities, so within the municipality. This bill has already been signed by the governor. LD 446, if you follow legislation at all, this began with the bill title and act to reestablish the state planning office, which was a terrible bill title for a variety of reasons, but it's now a resolve to establish a commission to research and recommend solutions for regional and municipal planning. This came out of committee without unanimous support. Excuse me, it passed to the House and Senate and is currently awaiting funding on the special study table. The same is the situation for LD 1246, which looks at developing more affordable home options and expanding home ownership in Maine. Came out of the committee without unanimous support, passed in the House and Senate, and is waiting for funding on the special study table. Finally, two bills that have been carried over to next year, to 2022. LD 1694 creates the Maine Redevelopment Land Bank Authority. GrowSmart supports the land bank infrastructure portion of this bill, though with serious reservations about the redevelopment commission that's also proposed there. The second, LD 1240, reviews barriers to regional solutions for housing choices. We worked with the sponsor to submit this resolve, which is an outcome of our Summit 2020. So as I said, we will be sending out a summary that gives more detail and links to these bills. This week is the time to engage. If there are bills that are of particular interest to you here that I've mentioned did not have unanimous support in the committee, that's generally a partisan vote, not always, and it's on the appropriations table, now is the time to reach out to your state representative and state senator and ask them to ask legislative leadership and the appropriations committee to fund those efforts in the final day. June 30th is when the legislature comes back into session, perhaps for one day to deal with the budget, these funding items, and the governor's bill for funding what she's going to do with the state's allocation of the American Rescue Plan Act. And finally, if you want to find out more or follow what we're doing, the policy page, public policy page on our website gives you all of our testimony and weekly updates that I've done through the course of the legislative session, and we'll do some more as we're wrapping up. So that's a look at the legislature and how that ties in with what we're all doing on a local level. And as we shift gears, Jeff, towards Q&A, and I catch up on some of the chats, you know, what I saw early on was a lot of chatter about the only rural tool that was in your graphic based on the density and what tools were there was the land trust. And you've talked about that quite a bit. But again, there's an opportunity there for more, or you may have seen some more items in the chat to discuss from now till 5 o'clock or so.
Sure, great. Let me go through some of the data that you got sent quickly first, and then we'll jump into Q&A. And you'll see those of you who registered a little ahead of time were emailed 2 packages. One was basically a shorter version of what I just presented. The other piece is really these sort of, how do you figure out what your local housing needs are? And this graphic, you know, I thought was helpful in terms of thinking about how you take the policy options that we just went through, which is sort of a universe, your local housing needs, sort of the yellow ball, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And then obviously you need to think about your political realities and your capacity as a community. You know, don't take on more than you can effectively do in a certain time period. Find 1 or 2 things and do them well if that's what you have the capacity to do. So looking at the data package, and I think a number of these graphics look really intimidating initially, which is why I want to spend just a moment walking through them and why this is sort of important data to think about when you start thinking about housing in your community. These charts have all generally been set up at the bottom with Maine at the far left, Kennebec County right next to it, and then a sampling of Southern Kennebec communities across the bottom. So to some extent, if you're really looking at 1 or 2 communities, you really only need to focus on those. It is helpful sometimes to compare to Maine and Kennebec County, which is why I also included those. But you don't necessarily need to think about all, 12 or 15 communities when you think about housing needs. Some of the data that I pulled out with the help of Will Harper from Kennebec Valley Council of Governments, who did the really heavy lifting on this. I mostly just made the graphics. Was how many units are renter occupied versus owner occupied? That's an important piece of data, and that varies a fair amount from community to community in Southern Kennebec. So you'll see in the blue here home ownership, and in the orange renter occupied units, and they both sort of have different policy needs, different criteria. Different issues. Also pulled out household sizes. Again, a little bit of variation in that. Certainly some outliers in terms of larger and smaller household sizes, but not as a huge range necessarily in this area. For those of you who really wanted to dig deep into household sizes, I broke it out a little more into actual sizes, not just average or median sizes. And you can see how many 1-person households there are, for example, how many 2-person, and so forth. The reason this is important is I also included this graphic, and I would encourage folks to take a moment to compare this graphic for the community you're interested in with this graphic, because you'll see whether the household sizes and the size of the units match up fairly quickly. And in some communities, they do very well. And in others, you'll find a difference. You might find that, for example, there are a lot of smaller units, and what you really need are larger family-sized units. Or on the flip side, you may find that you have a lot of smaller households and you have a lot of larger units. So when someone goes and looks for a studio apartment or a studio condo, they can't find one. The next piece really has to do with people who might be housing burdened. And so this is for households that own their homes. How many of them are spending more than 30% of their income on housing in the orange below. And so you'll see that's, it's a relatively consistent number across these communities, and it generally is about 1 in 5 households. When you look at rental households, you obviously, not surprisingly, see a much larger number of households that are renting burdened, that they're spending more than 30% of their income on rent. And this does vary a little bit more from community to community. And then you find some communities that, not surprisingly, have very few rentals at all. And maybe those are communities where you might focus on home ownership tools. Will pulled out the foreclosure numbers from the Kennebec County Registry, and I just made a graph of them, comparing them to the estimated overall number of households in this area. So these aren't absolute numbers, these are percentage numbers. But this is the percentage of households in the southern Kennebec area that went through a foreclosure from year to year. And so, you know, in 2013, it was not a great year for southern Kennebec. There were about 2% of households that went through a foreclosure process. Doesn't necessarily mean they ended up, you know, losing their home, but there certainly was a real housing challenge for those households. 2020 is lower, I think largely in part because of the COVID relief bills and foreclosure prevention. So it'll be interesting to see what happens after that. Hopefully it doesn't go up again, although unfortunately my suspicion is it will. The other thing that I talk about is that there are other things about your housing costs that you may not think about immediately. If you live in a place where you need multiple vehicles, say you have 2 workers in your household and you both have to drive to work because there's no other way to get there. Having vehicles that are safe, reliable, and can do what you need them to do, particularly in a Maine winter, can also cost money. And to some extent, that's part of your housing cost. So thinking about vehicle ownership by your community also is important. Communities where you tend to have 2 or more vehicles in households, you may need to nudge up the amount they need for a place to be affordable. And this varies a fair amount. What I will say about this number is I think people are always surprised how many households in Maine have 1 or no vehicles. It's a lot higher than most people would guess. Looking at seasonal units, you know, this is an issue in a lot of parts of Maine, maybe not quite as much in southern Kennebec as some parts, but there are certainly seasonal homes in this area, and thinking about how seasonal homes might affect your housing market, particularly as you know, you see these sort of what are, you know, these COVID movers, people who move to the region to get away from COVID. They may be starting off in a seasonal home and may become a year-round home eventually. Just another variable to think about as you think about your communities. And then I tracked how that changed over time. Again, you know, this is a very intimidating looking graphic, but really if you just look at one community, for example, Randolph, and you'll see that, you know, in 2019, 11% of the units were vacant or seasonal. In 2010, it was only 7%. So it may be just a fluke of the numbers, or it may be that something's happening in that community that is resulting in more seasonal and more vacant homes. And then finally, it's hard to get good information on the condition of housing in each community, but I used as a little bit of a proxy housing that was built before 1940, with the presumption that those tend to be units that need more maintenance. Now, it's not entirely fair because there's some wonderfully maintained old homes everywhere, but to try to get some sense of what housing rehabilitation needs there may be, communities with older housing like Hollowell or Gardner may have more challenges than communities like West Gardner with very few housing units built before 1940. So what do we do with this data? You know, the first thing is to really spend some time getting to know the 1 or 2 communities you're interested in. So put blinders on and try to not get distracted by the other ones and really focus on what you see from the data as your challenges and opportunities as a community. How do the household sizes and types compare? What are the affordability challenges in your community? What are some of these other factors? And this is not a universe of all the data you could look at, but this is just sort of an effort to warm up and start thinking about what you need to know to try to address housing challenges in your community. Then the second piece might say, well, what choices and opportunities exist based on what I found? Are there opportunities to take larger units and cut them up into smaller units and meet a need that's unmet in our community? Vice versa, is there a real need to try to encourage larger units to be constructed? Is there anything I can do to help encourage that? Are there issues with aging housing stock that might need some sort of rehab program? Things like that. And trying to put together the tools that we talked about during the first part of my presentation with the data that I sent you and that I went through quickly, and try to come up with some, you know, initial thoughts about a strategy. It doesn't have to be a final list, but maybe you say, you know what? I've looked at the data, I've looked at the tools, I'm really interested in doing a land trust in our community, and here's why. Or I'm interested in a housing trust, and here's why it might be useful. And again, like I said, I think this isn't a test where you get graded based on how many ideas you come up with. 1 or 2 good ideas is way more valuable than 5 or 6 ideas that maybe you haven't entirely thought through yet. So with that, I think I'm going to stop sharing and try to catch up on where we are for next steps. First off, I think we had some questions in the chat, and if you think of other questions, you can try to drop them in the chat while we get ready for next steps. A question about, is the data available on the census website for our individual communities? That's a great question. So there's a new census website called data.census.gov that I have to admit, initially, I really didn't like because it uses some sort of artificial intelligence to help figure out what you're asking. But it actually works really great now that I'm used to it. You can go on there and there's a little chat box and you type in housing West Gardiner 2019. And it'll pull up a bunch of tables and charts that are related to what you're asking. So obviously the more specific question you ask, the better. But I found it really helpful for pulling data for specific communities about specific things. Let me pull up what other questions there might be here. Can you speak to the use of density bonuses in rural village scenarios? It would really depend on the specific rural village scenario. What I will say is that when you compare what zoning often allows in those rural villages versus what people love about them and what attracts them to them, you often find that you're not allowed to build that anymore. So I do think using things like density bonuses, even just looking at your density in general in these rural villages is always worth taking a look at because you may often wonder why no one's building any of those great old houses anymore. And to some extent that's economics, but it also is zoning. Let's see, shout out to the, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say just that there was one other question about whether tiny houses included campers. And there was a bill last year that dealt with this in the Transportation Committee. And no, it does not. There's a very specific definition in statute for what tiny houses are. If you're interested in that, I can follow up and include that in the information that comes out after the webinar.
Great, great. Lots of great back and forth conversation about land trusts. I love that. That's great. I would love to go read those later, and I'm sure I'll learn a lot about them from all of you.
And you gotta love the shout out to the dogs. Even with our earbuds in, your dog barking got my dog barking. Thought I had a plan to keep him quiet.
Someone knocked on the door, and that's all he needed. Yeah. That is all the questions I see here. Does anyone have an additional question? It looks like maybe there's some new messages, but feel free to type in a question in the chat.
Dogs do love housing.
And I can certainly try to jump in. Let me go over to Q&A. There's nothing in there, but why don't you just type them in the chat if you have a question.
Yep.
And then we'll move into the next stage. Have you guys figured out what that is yet?
We have. We're going to pivot because we're good at that. I have one last comment on advocacy that was not part of my original presentation. When Jeff was talking about density bonuses with smart growth zoning and that Massachusetts 40R program provides for that, Maine had a bill, Representative Rachel Talbot Ross had a bill in this session, LD 1673. It's been carried over to next session. So that will be a topic of conversation for next year. To catch you all up, in our agenda, we're supposed to spend the next 40 minutes in breakout sessions. I have 6 fabulous volunteer facilitators. What we don't have is the knowledge that Zoom changed the rules, and we paid for a webinar for the added bonus of breakout rooms, and they don't function in webinars. So we are not able to go to breakout sessions, and our choices, Jeff and I and Emily Dufour have been messaging feverishly back and forth, are to send you all a link to a meeting, not a webinar, which does have breakout sessions, but I think we're going to lose too many people for that to happen. We have 30 people here. We have the capacity for the chat function. And if you all raise your hand, we can do allow to speak so that we can continue the conversation with the group of 30 rather than risking losing folks or one more Zoom snafu happening. So my thought is that we continue, and we have about 40 minutes of deeper discussion to be able to move forward. Emily put into the chat, I thought she did, but maybe not. Emily, would you please put into the chat one of the handouts that you would have gotten earlier today in an email with the 3 questions, putting housing data and tools together for your community. So we've spent time looking at data specifically for towns in Southern Kennebec County. And then Jeff outlined some tools. And again, the idea of a toolkit is you don't need a hammer every time. Hopefully you have a couple of tools in a couple of sizes that are going to fit your community or a neighborhood. So now that we've talked separately about both, to have a conversation about how they fit together in the world that you're seeing and go from there. So how does that sound for a way to move forward as we deal with the wonders of technology making our lives easier every day?
There also were 2 quick questions in the chat while you get organized. One was about community visioning processes, and I saw a shout out to the Lewiston effort, which I would definitely check out if you were interested in that. The one thing I would mention on community visioning processes is, although they're often supposed to be very open-ended, it is important for people to realize that every sort of decision has trade-offs. So if you decide we want to preserve areas by not allowing housing in them, what's the challenge you're going to create in this community in return for that? Is there a way to have a win-win in your visioning? So I love thinking about visioning in a slightly more constrained way than perhaps is often thought about. The second question had to do with targeted market analyses. And I think those are very helpful for larger communities. Sometimes I feel like it's really easy to get lost in the data though. You don't need thousands of pages of data to make a decision about a smaller community. So I think the analysis is really helpful, but I wouldn't get too bogged down in analyzing versus taking the data you need and trying to make some policy decisions. There's always a balancing act there. Back to you, Nancy.
I'm going to look to the chat to see if there's any immense opposition to continuing in a group of 30. I don't think it's undoable. Again, you can enter a question or a thought in the chat as we have been doing, or if you, along the bottom of your screen, you raise your hand, Emily will allow you to speak so that if it's more than you want to chat and you actually want to chat, we can do it that way. So unless there's any opposition, I think we're going to move forward that way. And again, you have the link in the chat to the 3 questions. And as Emily just put up, the first one is, and again, we can look beyond the data that's specific to Southern Kennebec County, but when you're looking at, most of us are coming with a particular community in mind, whether it's my friend Sarah, who is in Winthrop, or I've got St. George community I can see on the line here, or you've got a region. Looking at the data or what you know of the data in your community and going with those questions. Jeff, do you want to kind of do a little bit more to set the stage with that, with the, if we did about 10 minutes on discussion specific to data or any questions about how it relates to your area?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't think this isn't a quiz and you don't need to sort of worry too much about what you see, but I also think it's important to realize you may only see one thing that jumps out at you when you look at your community. It's not a question of, oh, I see the need for these 6 different things. You may say, wow, I didn't realize how many people in our community only had 1 vehicle. And I wonder if that's because they can't afford a second vehicle or because they're living in an area that's more walkable, or what are some of the things that might suggest in terms of housing policy. Really the renters in our community are the ones that are struggling, not the homeowners. And is there something we can do to maybe help renters in our community? So really, it doesn't need to be a long list of solutions, particularly for relatively small communities. Sometimes it's just a couple of things. I see a question on whether the census has data on number of vehicles. It does. So you should be able to pull that off of data.census.gov pretty easily.
What are some other things that struck you in the data that we saw? I live in Monmouth and was surprised that Monmouth was on the extreme on some of the data pieces. I think one higher than the rest of the region for those where housing costs exceeded 30%. You know, I picture Monmouth, describe Monmouth as a suburban town that wants to be rural, as I think many of them are. They want to describe themselves as rural, but they're suburban. So and any other reflections on the data, whether specific to those towns or what it means for your community?
Yeah, I'd love to hear from people who know these communities far better than I do as to what they're seeing and what their thoughts are. So you know, just dropping that in the chat and we can sort of act as facilitators. Thoughts about tools to specifically help renters is one of the questions that came up in the chat. There definitely are things like tenant-based rental assistance that particularly cities that are lucky enough to be HUD entitlement communities and have access to dedicated, say, home funds can use. But there are other ways of funding these sorts of tools as well. I think there is a challenge with helping with rent in that, unlike, for example, creating a permanently affordable housing unit, when you help fund rent, every month you're funding that rent. So, you know, it can become very expensive, I guess, just to be perfectly blunt about it, which doesn't mean the community shouldn't do it, but it's a real commitment. If you're buying into making sure that a household isn't rent burdened, you may be buying a monthly sort of subsidy, and just be aware of that. I've seen slightly more focused tools where rather than providing ongoing rental subsidies, they may help, for example, with the security deposit and just say, look, we can't help you every month with rent, but we can help you up front by covering your security deposit. And, you know, and we'll do that once for a household so that, you know, it's not like every time the household moves, they necessarily are able to access that tool again. It's not as good as getting monthly sort of rental subsidies, but it does help. Because that upfront payment of sometimes first month, last month, a fee and security deposit can be a real impediment to people getting into rental housing sometimes.
So Jeff, I'll give you a second to read. There's been a couple of points brought up about the crazy housing market right now because of the influx of folks. We're all seeing that. There was a Maine Calling yesterday did their show on the pandemic in migration and the impact that it's having. And I think, as I said, we're going to be seeing more and more of that as we move forward.
Yep, I see an interesting comment about coastal communities and islands needing more rental property. And I think that's a really important point. And again, that might be something that would direct, you know, housing policy efforts towards increasing your rental stock. And that's not necessarily something you'll do through zoning, for example, because zoning tends to be a little bit invisible about ownership versus rental, but maybe there's other programs that can help encourage rental development. For example, you know, if you allow multifamily, it's more likely to be rental than something that people might buy as seasonal homes. Not always, but you know, that might be something that you can help direct policy with. I would agree it is a tough one, but it's certainly something you hear in many of these communities that are, you know, where you're seeing a lot of seasonal homes.
Mark, I'd ask you a follow-up question. You mentioned the need for additional rental, but what about home ownership? And then I'm going to couple that while you're pondering that one, a question for everyone about the language that we use that, you know, I said in the introduction, part of what we want to do today is give you all language to push back against resistance that you may see in your communities about affordable housing. And there's been a progression from affordable housing to workforce housing. And we talk about housing choices, that there needs to be a mix. So adding that into the conversation and then looking to Mark about, again, ownership versus specifically finding rental, if it's preference that people choose to rent, where there's the gap.
Great, I'm seeing some questions in Q&A and some in chat. I'm gonna move over to the Q&A for a second, and then I'll move back to the chat. A question about communities that are feeling pressure and have, you know, many owners or renters paying over 30% of the income, you know, therefore being burdened with housing. The question is, what's the number one thing that you should do to start addressing this? Well, it's very hard, as you mentioned in your question. It really depends on what you're seeing. If you're seeing that like a huge percentage of your households are paying over 30% of their income, that probably suggests that there needs to be more housing production in your community, that supply and demand are just not connected. And that could potentially be addressed through additional housing production. That's going to be a tough conversation because it may take a fair amount of new housing production to really drive that number down. But that's the one thing I would suggest, in as much as there is one thing to look at first. I would encourage looking at a bunch of different tools though, because it may be as another way to address that. A question about LD 1312. Do you want to take that, Nancy?
I'm just reading it. So if you want to take something from the chat, I'll take a look at that.
Sure. There was a question about the rural-urban distinction, and an acknowledgement that the names aren't perfect, but how you sort of think about that. And yeah, I mean, like a lot of these things, I tend to find it as more of a continuum than these are rural and these are urban communities. We were talking earlier about the classification of suburban community and how it doesn't really quite apply in Maine the way it might in New Jersey or California. You have a lot of communities that have active farms and areas that, where people commute into the city in maybe a more traditional subdivision. So I do think that there isn't as much of a difference as people think, and that a lot of these tools can apply in both contexts. Sometimes it just comes down to the size of the community, because I always recommend the communities don't take on more than they can handle. So a rural community may just simply be a smaller community, and it may mean that you need to focus on 1 or 2 housing programs and do them well.
Okay, so the question was basically a look at the bill that actually passed and again is waiting to be funded, about accessory dwelling units versus what's in California. And I don't have information on California. Hopefully I can cut and paste. If you ignore the numbers in here, because I'm lifting it right from the bill, this is the language of the amendment. Municipalities in Maine are required to allow 1 accessory dwelling unit as long as it complies with minimum shoreline zoning for DEP. And it does allow locally adopted ordinances. Let me look. So there is the ability for locally adopted ordinances. And with GrowSmart's conversation in negotiating the amendment, you'll note at the 16, a municipality may not adopt an ordinance or regulation that circumvents this requirement. Again, you can't create an ordinance that makes it impossible to have ADUs. And it does require that either the primary or accessory is owner occupied. So I can tell you a bit of the evolution that the bill came in. It would require municipalities to allow 1 ADU per lot where they allow single family residences, and was very restrictive on what municipalities could manage about whether parking or setbacks or short-term rentals or requiring an owner-occupied situation. And it was GrowSmart Maine, one of our board members, Lynn Seeley, actually weighed in on this for us, prepared our testimony where we agreed with some but not all of those restrictions. In particular, short-term rentals are still fairly new. They're contentious. There is at least the perception that it changes a neighborhood into a transitory place where you just have people who are not committed to the neighborhood living there. And the same with owner occupied. The perception at least is that if someone is living there too, then there's going to be less trouble with whoever's living in the other unit. A lot of this comes because they're new and there's uncertainty and people resist change. That's just human nature, and it's perfectly fine that we do. That's why we've survived evolution this far. But I like where it landed, that it has to be owner occupied. It does give the municipalities flexibility, and we'll see what they do with it. But there was genuine concern, and there's still concern about what this means. It doesn't mean that instantly every single family property is going to have an ADU, but I look at my neighborhood in Monmouth and what it can mean for retired folks who live in big houses or other people who have room where they could put a smaller unit out back. And the advantages are huge, and you're all interested in housing, so you probably know all this information, but this is, I think, a rock solid step forward for this and for tiny houses. Let's move forward. They're not going to be a priority for every municipality when it comes to what ordinance to deal with next, but it's in place. And I think that Maine is going to be well served by it.
Thanks, Nancy. Going through some of these other questions, and I'm going sort of roughly in order. there was a question about mobile homes in poor condition. And, you know, it's another thing we were talking about before this is with a lot of interest in tiny homes, which I think are worth looking at. There's been a sort of I don't feel mobile homes have necessarily gotten the attention they should. And I would say I'm not aware immediately of tools specifically to help with mobile homes in poor condition, but this might be a chance where you go outside the toolbox and come up with a tool of your own, because I think mobile homes do provide a key part of the affordability solution statewide. And if that's something that your community is interested in investing in, just because no one else has done it doesn't mean you couldn't do it. A comment about construction costs. I think that is a standing challenge right now, and I'm not sure we have an easy answer to that. Last I heard, lumber costs may be going down finally, and that's promising, but that is a challenge, especially in places that really bring other costs to the table, like large land costs through large lot sizes and just valuable property or other mitigation costs. So I don't have an easy answer to that. We'll just have to track that for now. Question about data for downtowns. If you go on data.census.gov, you can pull things up as fine grained as you want, but it's helpful to know, for example, your census tract or block group numbers. So that may be something you need to do a little research on. But it's actually surprisingly easy to do that. If you Google, there's tools online that can show you what your actual census tract and block group numbers are. I always write them down because I never remember them. And then you can search for those numbers specifically in data.census.gov and get a focus on a smaller area of your community. What I would say though is you should always truth check this. It's always helpful to go do a field survey and walk around and take notes about the buildings, because the census is in Washington and they're not necessarily as focused on your downtown as you are.
There's an interesting point there from City of Bangor about younger workers simply not being interested in owning at this point. So.
Yep, there certainly does seem to be a trend in that direction, and there's a lot of speculation as to why. But I think rental housing is going to continue to be more popular over the next 10 or 20 years, and communities that want to address housing challenges and attract new residents, that's something they should think about, because many communities tend to be dominated by owner-occupied units, especially as you get out of urban areas. Let's see, what other questions are good? What about partnerships between nonprofits, towns, and land trusts? I think the best way to come up with a coherent strategy is to have all these partners talking and coordinating. And sometimes that's as simple as just setting up a quarterly meeting between different people who are interested in housing policy in your community. And I would definitely encourage that. There's not enough resources to going around for people to compete with one another. And there's some real opportunities. For example, Habitat for Humanity may have certain skill sets they can bring to the table. And then maybe a nonprofit sort of LIHTC affordable housing developer has another set of tools. And maybe coordinating them really can be helpful. So I would definitely recommend at least convening meetings to make sure that everyone knows what's going on the whole in your community. And I think a lot of communities do that already. Let's see.
Brittany, I hope I answered your question about the ADUs. Because municipalities can limit short-term rentals, they can decide if the Airbnb is an issue they want to address by limiting or prohibiting that use of the ADU or the primary unit.
Let's see, there was another question here somewhere, but I keep scrolling past it. Yeah, but shout out to the Maine Housing Interactive Data Tools. I don't mean to say you have to go to the census. Maine Housing has done a lot of that heavy lifting for you. They have some nice sort of data sets on dashboards that you can pull up for things like housing affordability by community. I would definitely look at what they have. They're doing some great work and can save you some effort. Let's see, every time I look at this, there's new questions.
I was going to say, while Jeff continues to review, I want to bring up again the question that I brought. What are you all seeing in your communities when you talk about affordable housing or workforce housing or housing choices? How much are you seeing resistance to it? There was an op-ed in the, I think it was the Press Herald out of Bath recently that talked about affordable housing as being an asset for a community and not a burden. And so I'm interested to hear from you all. And again, encourage you, if you raise your hand, then we can allow you to speak and you can hear other voices on this as well.
And I'll post that while you're doing that. I think I have a link to that.
Okay. Now, and Mary Ellen, you're exactly right. I mean, the connection between housing and economic development because of workforce is critical. Gives me a chance to talk about, because why not do everything in one day? GrowSmart is co-sponsoring Policy Matters from the Press Herald tonight at 6:30 to 8 about early childhood education. That's another critical barrier to economic growth is whether it's childcare or actual education. I was on a different call this morning with Jason Judd of Educate Maine, and it was nice. He actually thanked GrowSmart for sponsoring the evening event and said that he's excited for the conversation that's going to come. So you can look at our Facebook page and see, if you are not zoomed out yet, that at 6:30 there's a conversation about early childhood education and what that means for economic development for Maine, both for parents who need someplace for their kids to be when they're working and the future workforce, because they grow up fast, as we all know.
Nancy, we have Will Harper who raised his hand and has a question. Will, you can go ahead and unmute and you should be able to speak.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Will. I work for Kennebec Valley Council of Governments as a community resilience coordinator. And one of the things that I've seen in conversations around housing has, echoing what Mary Ellen posted in the chat, that there is a recognition by an increasing number of sectors that housing is essential. But one of the things that I was wondering, Jeff, maybe if you have any thoughts on this, in every one of these conversations, it becomes apparent that the cost of building housing just doesn't make numbers work for building the sort of housing we think of as being affordable. And I'm reflecting back on conversations that I had with, I remember a particular conversation about one of the high-rise apartment buildings built in Portland, where the developer pointed out that increasing housing is the name of the game. Having more apartments available to everybody will invariably lower the cost. And while I won't speak to the veracity of that, it does seem like fewer and fewer developers are interested in developing that like housing that's accessible, just because it's so expensive. So I was wondering, Jeff, if you've seen anything that you think could give us a little bit of hope in that.
Yeah, this touches again on some of these related housing costs. Some of it's supply equipment, some of it is permitting, some of it is simply the, when you look at the cost of land that you need in a certain community to develop, it just doesn't work. So I think one of the steps that can help is, if you are interested in hearing about what the specific challenges are, ask local developers. Certainly sitting down with a couple of local developers, you'll hear a lot of things that some of which you may be able to do something about and some of which you may not. Obviously individual communities can't affect the cost of lumber. But if you hear, look, one of the problems here is your minimum lot sizes are too large for me to make work. I want to develop housing in your community, but I can't do it at the density that you allow.
We're all hoping Jeff will be right back. I'm eager to resume in-person meetings, I think, at this point. Jeff, you're back. We lost you.
Oh, sorry about that. Yes, I got an unstable warning. Like I said, just to close the loop, talking to developers about what maybe is keeping them from doing development in your community. And again, not necessarily saying those are all 100% true and I must address them right away, but it's very informative to hear what some of the limiting factors may be in their minds. It may not be cost of construction. It may be simple things like your parking requirement or your minimum lot size. And those may be things you are or aren't willing to do something about as a community, but at least realizing those are the factors and being able to weigh that against your desire to produce more housing and come up with a policy decision.
I would just add to that too, that again, the 3 studies that are moving forward LD 609, which is already signed by the governor, so will be happening, is specifically about municipal barriers to housing opportunities. Looking at, is there zoning or land use that is creating this barrier for developers? And the other piece of it is removing those barriers while looking at the incentives, where Maine now has the state low-income housing tax credit specifically to address the fact that there are costs associated with building. And if you're going to have lower rents or lower income coming in, that's got to be met somewhere with public dollars. And so hopefully the combination of removing barriers and having incentives will help address this problem as well.
Nancy, we have Ken Ackley on the line with a question.
Terrific.
Go ahead, Ken.
Hello, Nancy. Hello, Jeff. Thanks for taking my question. In my community, there's oftentimes some either passive aggressive or open hostility to being welcoming to families with school-age kids. Mm-hmm. The stated concern is, the educational costs that come along with families that move to my town. Can you give me an idea of whether that's a real thing, and your response to that sort of line of thinking?
Sure, that's a really good question, Kent, and I bet you're not alone in having that question come up when people think about new housing. I worked in a community in another state where this was the #1 issue, and it was really, I joked that all land use policy in that community was guided by the school system, and that was the #1 decision in any housing sort of policy debate. And I think we have to acknowledge that there is a potential kernel of truth in some communities where your schools are full and you're faced with that very large fixed cost of building another school building. There could potentially be a very considerable new cost from new housing. On the other hand, there are many communities, and I think I might have seen someone mention this in the chat just now, where the schools were built for a time when there were more school kids in their community. And if they haven't consolidated or closed a bunch of schools, they may actually have extra capacity in their school system. And then you're faced with marginal costs, hiring more teachers, getting more iPads, whatever else you might need for additional students. And those are costs, but they're a lot cheaper than building a new school building. So, I think it really depends from community to community. One way to try to get your head around that is to do some sort of analysis of what might be needed based on a certain number of additional school children entering your school system, to get a real sense of what the financial costs can be. If you feel that that's something that needs to be covered by new development, you do have the option of looking at impact fees as a way of helping pay for some of those fixed costs. That will, of course, potentially discourage new housing development, so you need to sort of balance that. But there is a tool that you could potentially use to address those costs. I always suggest that people make sure it's real first. Particularly, people always assume there's going to be tons and tons of kids in every housing unit, particularly in communities that have strong school systems. And the numbers, when you go back and check later, tend to show that there are a lot fewer kids in those buildings than you think. So looking at peer communities, looking at other communities that have done similar analysis can do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. But you're not alone. That's a very common concern related to new housing, again, particularly in communities that people move to for the schools.
And I would just add to that too, and I think picking up on some of the questions, it's not just the kind of housing, it's where it's located. That you all know we're smart growth, that if it's infill, if it's additional housing units where you've already got roads, water, sewer, the school bus already drives by, that has an impact for it. The other thing, one of the things I love about working with GrowSmart Maine is this statewide perspective we have, that we've worked with communities. We had a housing forum years ago in Southern Maine because there was that attitude about we don't want any more families here. We would like to become a retirement community. And then we did work in Eastport, where in Eastport community members were bouncing around the idea of offering homesteading, that there were abandoned homes. And if families that had school-age children came in, fixed up the house, that in 5 years they could have it for free. They were that interested in keeping their school open at that point. So there's a lot to consider. And I think the other thing, having children in your community is more than the cost of educating them. It is the life of the community. It is who uses the businesses that are local in there. It's the vitality. It's who considers it the hometown. There's so much more to the cost of educating children. There's so much more to actually having children grow up in your town that's going to improve its resiliency moving into the future.
Mm-hmm. A comment about encouraging ways to encourage a question about how to encourage municipalities to solve housing challenges collaboratively. I think that's a great idea. I know the Greater Portland Council of Governments has done a lot of work to have a regional conversation about housing in the Greater Portland region through their Metro Regional Coalition. And, you know, I think regional planning agencies or chambers of commerce or other organizations that naturally cover a larger area are great places to have these conversations. Because a lot of these solutions are regional in nature, whether just by coordinating policy or by, you know, a little more comprehensively all going in the same direction.
And I'll add an advocacy approach to that one as well with LD 1240, which was on my summary, looking at regional barriers. One of the things that we're looking to have addressed in that bill is the mill rate differential. And whether it's cities that are service centers or in the rural areas, the rural hubs that have very small communities or unorganized territories around them, when the mill rate differential or the net property tax paid is significant, you end up with sprawl and not with a coordination of effort for housing or other development. So there's a lot to it, and GrowSmart is picking our battles that we think that we can fight to make things better with this.
Sure. A couple of more questions. One I saw about, you know, the different fiscal impacts of different types of units. There's definitely some truth to that. You know, and if you do want to go do a deeper dive, you will find that different unit types, rental, home ownership, high rise, mid rise, low rise, single family homes, they all have different types of fiscal impacts. And, you know, in general, the fiscal impact is lower when you go to higher density, which is counterintuitive. But because you're sharing the cost of a bunch of services, you don't have many miles of roads that need to be plowed. Multifamily, for good or for bad, tend to have fewer school kids per unit. So you tend to find that as you go into a higher density development type, the fiscal impacts tend to be better for a community. And also just important to dispel one of the myths, which is often that housing inherently costs communities money, that every housing unit is a drain on a community. And if that's true, your tax rate isn't really right. There's something wrong there if that's happening. And in reality, most often, most housing actually will at least break even, and sometimes will actually raise money for a community. There are certain types of housing that cost communities money, but that's not all housing. So I think in as much as you're willing to do an analysis like that, it will help inform the debate.
And I think that conversation comes up too with the flip side of that, farmland, with the property taxes that are brought in versus the municipal services that are required. It's a complex issue. There's Will Harper put in something about non-professional developers, and Jeff, while you're reading up on that, one of the other resources we can share with you after the webinar is something that GrowSmart created called Bridging the Divide. And it's a set of 3, they're not white papers, they're only 2 or 3 pages each, but it's helping developers understand how to do community engagement so that it is true community engagement and you're engaging with the neighbors and neighborhood associations. There's an outline of the decision tree that a developer uses and an actual scenario of the money involved in a development so that the people who are seeing a development come into their neighborhood can better understand the thought process a developer is doing. And then finally, there's an actual mock-up of what a development process is in Portland. And that may be out of date, but it shows what the developer goes through. But again, for GrowSmart, anything we can do to bring the 2 sides together in a meaningful conversation that will get rid of some of these barriers is going to be tremendously helpful, I think.
Yep. On the issue of non-professional developers, I think this is sort of what the Strong Towns movement is a little bit about, is the idea that people should do these small organic developments as opposed to, you know, what is often framed as the larger developers that are potentially less concerned about their community. I don't see it as an either or. I think there's some great small scale 2, 3, 4 unit infill development being done by non-professionals. But I also do think there's a space for larger developers. And here's why. I think that sometimes going through a process that can be risky and that requires an extensive public review requires the ability to basically lose money to make money. So the idea that you can put soft costs up front to engage with the community, to come up with solutions, to do things like apply for low-income housing tax credits that takes time and money. I don't think every small-scale developer has the capacity or the interest in doing that. So I view it as a yes, both, please. Let's see the small-scale developers do projects that are appropriate for that scale. But this is where I might differ a little bit from strong towns. I also think there's a role for these larger developers, if only because they tend to be able to access money from out of your community that can help build housing in your community. And that can be hard to get if you're not experienced with it. I saw a great question from someone about why is income diversity important to a community's well-being and financial well-being. I can't say it better than Deb Keller's op-ed that I put in the chat. I would definitely read that. I think she does a great job in outlining the arguments as to why housing choice is a real asset in the community. And I always try to steal that argument because I think it's really important not to be defensive and say, well, it's not going to hurt your community that much. It's going to go way beyond not hurt your community. It's going to help your community a lot. There are people in your community who may not be interested or able to stay in their big old house as they age. They may be interested in a single level development where it's a condo, where they don't have to mow the lawn anymore. They'd love to stay in your community. There's no place for them to live in your community. Don't you want them to stay? These are important things to bring up when people talk about housing choices. So I think that's a great point. Thank you for mentioning it.
I love the conversations that are happening here in the chat, and we'll be saving that and somehow capturing that as well. I don't want us to run out of time with the third question. Emily, I know you posted it a little while ago, but the chat's been so active, we've lost it. What I want to know as we look at continuing the conversation for a little bit longer and then wrapping up is from what you've heard today and what you're bringing to the conversation in this forum, looking at the set of tools that Jeff put out there. Hopefully some of them are new to you, maybe some are comfortable and you understand them, but can you identify a top couple that, that you think that you're going to be exploring to address the issues in your community? I'd love to know both within Southern Kennebec County as we're working with this Working Community Challenge, but again, across the state. This housing choices for a well-rounded community is something that GrowSmart is eager to dive into across the state. So as follow-up, what are the tools that you want to know more about? What can we do to connect you with people who know about these or to develop resources so that you all can crack this nut in the towns where you live or work? So more resources being shared in this chat. That's fantastic.
But a simple question, I apologize for using acronyms. It seems to be hard to avoid. The question of what does TIF stand for? So TIF is tax increment finance. And at its root, it's a way of helping fund either infrastructure that's needed for new development or sometimes to provide a direct subsidy to development you want to see in your community by basically saying your tax bill will be, let's say, $100,000 after you're built, but we're not going to get anything if you don't build it. So we'll actually split that with you. We'll collect $50,000 and we'll give you half of that to help fund your development. Now, obviously, there's a risk there that you're giving away tax money that you don't have to give away. And it's always important to think through these decisions carefully. But there definitely are situations where it helps good things happen in the community. And again, I go back to the affordable housing type of tax increment financing, which I see as generally very beneficial to increasing housing choice in a community.
So Mark mentioned reducing barriers to the current zoning. I don't know if you mean political barriers or I'd love to know more about what that is if you're willing to share. And eager to hear from others what you think you might take away from this and what further resources GrowSmart could help provide.
Mark, I've given you permission to speak, so you can go ahead and ask your question.
Terrific.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we just, as I noted, just got cluster zoning passed, which I think is important to a project that we're contemplating. But first you have to go through the subdivision process, which is 40 pages long. And this just added even more restrictions in order to pull off the cluster development part of the whole thing. So we just started a comprehensive plan project here. And one of the things in there is to find some way to streamline at least the, I don't want to use the word affordable housing. That's not popular. We call it year-round housing. You know, possibilities in the future by having a much simpler process for that. I mean, I guess we'll get through it if we have to, but it's daunting. It's daunting. So that's what I meant by that.
Yep, and that's a really good point. One of the things that I try to work with various stakeholders to think about is look at things like your land use code and what are the pieces that are really important to keep that you know really address clearly identified issues in your community, and what sort of maybe requirements that maybe seem innocuous to you working say in a town hall, but to a developer can be very intimidating or can actually prohibit development from happening. And separating out those things that you really need to keep from the things that maybe have just been in that code for 50 years and are just there because they've always been there. You know, you need to submit 3 copies in triplicate in paper, you know, and it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but the things that you find in zoning codes that haven't been updated in a while, where the people in the city don't necessarily care, town don't necessarily care about them, but they're in the code. So I would encourage communities to take this issue seriously and think about what's in their code, what's important to preserve, because I'm not a total deregulator. I don't believe in just throwing out the zoning code. I think there's a lot of value in the code, but I think there's also a lot that's not of value in those codes. And making that differentiation and trying to make it so that people who want to do the type of development you want to see can have an easiest time of it as possible. And sometimes, again, that comes back to sitting down with a focus group of people who do development and hearing what their concerns are. Again, not necessarily changing everything based on their concerns, but really digesting it and seeing if there's a chance to remove some steps in a process. A couple of years ago, Maine was able to amend its subdivision requirements. It used to be that multifamily housing was always considered a subdivision in addition to potentially going through site plan review process. And you know, this was an interesting alliance of professional planners and professional developers who worked to say, if you have a site plan review process in your community, the development doesn't also have to go through subdivision. So that was one chance where both groups agreed to streamline a process in state law. And if you can do it in state law, you can definitely do it on the local level. It's a lot easier.
A question, Jeff, in the chat about the perception that it's easier to build a garage than an ADU. Do you have a sense of how real that perception is?
Well, I think there's some real building code reasons why it is easier. I think there are some challenges. I know that I've had experiences of people who wanted to build an accessory dwelling unit and found out that under local code, that meant they needed to sprinkler not just the accessory unit, but their entire home. And that was to them cost prohibitive. Why should I need to sprinkler my home? It's never been sprinklered before, but suddenly it's considered a 2-family by code. I don't necessarily have an opinion about whether that's good or bad, but I think those are the types of things that come up when someone wants to add an accessory dwelling unit. Because at the end of the day, it's a set, people are living there, which is a higher impact than a garage. And some of it's, you know, there's a little bit of a risk analysis there in terms of how important is it that somebody actually sprinkler their home when they add an accessory unit. Now, to some people, it's worth any cost if there's any chance of there being an incident. In reality, everything has a weighing of costs and benefits. And thinking about that, maybe they just have to sprinkler the new unit. You know, there are things like that that can be evaluated, but that goes beyond zoning and goes into, you know, who controls the city's code and who's willing to look at what impacts it might have on housing. So it's definitely easier to build a garage than an accessory dwelling unit. I doubt that will change, but maybe there are ways to make it a little easier to build that accessory unit. There's a question about cooperative housing in Portland, and I think a lot of what I've seen being discussed does relate to a land trust effort as well. But I have to admit, I haven't been keeping up on every single housing development in Portland in the last few months. So if someone else knows more about it, I'd certainly yield to them.
And I put in, just to mention, a shout out to Raise Up, which is cooperative housing in Lewiston. Gosh, I wish I could remember offhand how many, if they're on their third or fourth apartment building now, that's now owned by the residents. And they won, they were winners of one of the Maine Smart Growth Awards at last year's summit. So it is coming, and it is a great model to get people transition into home ownership. What other tools are you all going to take away from here or want to know more about? This is a tremendous conversation.
One thing I mentioned earlier, but I would definitely circle back to, because I think a lot of communities may feel overwhelmed about all these options. Almost every community owns land. Almost every city and town owns land that it's not using. Either they got it through tax title, or they've just owned it for a long time, or the state gave it to them at some point. That's a good place to start. What land do we own, and how much of it do we really need to keep? Is there some of it that we could potentially give or sell for housing production? I would recommend communities start with that, if nothing else.
There's the link to Raise Up. As we're getting ready to transition, again, I don't want to cut off the conversation. I also don't want to labor too terribly long here, but a couple of reminders. GrowSmart Maine will be hosting our summit once again. It's going to be November 4th this year, and we're doing the same model that we did last year of I don't know what the limit will be yet, but we're expecting probably a smaller group of people at an anchor location in Biddeford, and then having satellite locations across the state, November 4th, and then virtual participation as well for people who aren't quite ready to even join in small groups. The reason I bring it up now is that our focus is going to be on rural and looking at challenges that are specific to rural communities in Maine. There was a comment earlier about, well, how do you define urban and rural? And sometimes it's just letting people self-define. But we're looking at the links of particularly inland rural and what their challenges are when it comes to the climate action plan and for the state's 10-year economic development plan. So there's interesting work still ahead.
Any last questions people have?
This is Emily speaking. I just want to remind people that when you exit the webinar today, there will be 3-question survey. If you could please answer it, that will help us formulate better and more and other effective presentations in the future. So thank you.
And I think we're agreeable to, we can give you back 10 minutes of your evening. You expected to be here until 6 o'clock. That gives me 40 minutes till the Policy Matters webinar on early childhood development. I'm definitely going to that one as well. I want to thank the Southern Kennebec Working Community Challenge Steering Committee for working with us on developing and marketing this. Thank you to my facilitators who were ready for the breakout session, and to all of you for taking it in stride. Zoom changed the rules on us. We did not know the breakout sessions were not going to be working in this webinar setting. So do complete the survey. It helps us know what more we can do to help you with these statewide issues. What I've loved about tonight, these conversations are why I love my job, but you know, we pivoted. We did not plan this, but I loved being able to do side by side with Jeff on here's the boots on the ground implication, and being able to say, and here's the advocacy, here's the legislative counterpart to that. I hope that you found that as interesting and as exciting, or at least a little bit as much as I did. We look forward to continuing the conversation with you. So last thoughts, Jeff?
I just want to thank Will Harper for all his data analysis. I want to thank Emily for handling things, especially rolling with the changing Zoom rules. And thanks to Nancy, as always, for keeping GrowSmart Maine chugging along. I really enjoyed this. This was really fun, and thanks for coming.
Good, I appreciate it. Thanks to you all. Do complete the survey and enjoy the extra 10 minutes in your evening. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.